Thomas Beller is an associate professor of English at Tulane University, a regular contributor to The New Yorker, and the author of J.D. Salinger, The Escape Artist, How to Be a Man, and Seduction Theory, among other books. He's noted that his writing differs in form and genre, but tends to share a lot of the same preoccupations. So the dynamics of relationships, a sense of place, and a preoccupation with the nature and effect of time. We talk in this conversation about his book Lost in the Game, a book about basketball, which is definitely concerned with this question of time. I ask him about his sense that pickup basketball especially has its own time, ruled by the sun, he says, or by the willingness of those with a ball to keep shooting in the dark. We even circle around to this experience of shooting in the dark and try to see it as a metaphor for players that have a way of approaching the game with a sort of second sight. Players like Nikola Jokic or Kareem Abdul-Jabber, these all-time great titans of the game. But we also zoom in on the embodied experience of putting up shots and what it means for practice, to feel like something is both meditative and ritualistic, mindful and maniacal. Thomas was kind of astonished that I care as much as I do about basketball. And of course, this is a podcast that is often very serious, where I'm clearly really dedicated to working through some despairing and deeply scary issues with people. So in a sense, this episode is almost like an interlude between these more serious concerns, but honestly, I take basketball pretty seriously too. In the same way that Marcus Boone spoke to me about his personal relationship with music over the years, how music lets us think about the sort of war for our time that people are constantly engaged in. I wanted to talk to Beller because I think his ideas are also about that pursuit of a more engaging, autonomous relationship to time, beyond just being productive for the sake of it. As he puts it in the book, there is joy in being lost in the game, a joy that doesn't have to be relinquished. So Thomas and I talk about what we love about basketball, the things about the sport that fill us with ambivalence, and why we keep coming back to it. We get to a point where we sort of say we appreciate both the anarchic and analytic aspects of the game, the dance and the discipline. You know, why do we care about a sport that still tends to be dominated by a discourse of intense and androcentric competition? Is that healthy? What kind of a use of public space is playground basketball? What effects has professionalization had on the sport? So, this book that you've written is about basketball, but it's certainly about more than that. So while I definitely want to talk to you about this recent NBA season that's just concluded and the road that the Denver Nuggets took to the championship, I wanted to start by asking about how the book was written. You say that there was a moment in writing the book where you didn't know that you were writing a book about basketball. That's really interesting to me, given that the title metaphor of the book is being lost in the game. So in a sense, the book is, I think, recreating that feeling of being lost in the game kind of through the writing. There's like that rhythm to it. I might be editorializing. It feels to me like it mirrors a sense of being in a flow state when playing basketball. Did you, when you were writing, try to leave room for flow, improvisation, and unconsciousness when you were writing it?
Well, first of all, that's a very flattering, perceptive, and by me appreciated take. I would say, I don't leave room for those things in writing. I feel writing sort of embodies those things. Or, I have to kind of chip away at various defenses and impediments to get to that condition at which point writing can begin. To answer your question about, when was the book being consciously written, just as a sort of prologue to that answer, I feel like a lot of my books they're trying to take weaknesses and recast them as virtues. And that might be true of like every short story writer, which was what my first book was. I definitely belong to a generation of writers who has labored under this sort of burden of feeling like you really ought to be publishing a novel. I kind of half managed to with my second book. So in this case, there's a lot of unconsciousness in the composition of pieces. And then at some point, I think with every book I've written, with the possible exception of this biography of J.D. Salinger, where I had this like tyrannical, interesting editor in my face the whole time. But they're kind of like groping in the dark. I think Don DeLillo said, writing a novel is like taking a cross-country trip at night with the headlights off. So I definitely belong to the driving in the dark and hopefully laughing in the dark school.
I like that. I mean, and I do see echoes of it in the way that you kind of talk about the temporality of playground basketball. I mean, you write that basketball played in public spaces like the playground happens on its own time, ruled by the sun or by the night lights or by the willingness of those with the ball to keep shooting in the dark. And I've had that experience of shooting in the dark, and it's interesting, how it changes the kind of movement of your body and your sense of where the rim is. I see that idea about like the temporality of playground basketball as connected to the way that you kind of philosophize a little bit about practice as something that might be more meditative and ritualistic, kind of like yoga practice, you say.
Totally.
Basketball fans are going to know or have associations between practice and I think like Allen Iverson's famous rant where he says practice like dozens of times.
Yes.
But that thing of practice is about sort of reflecting on the meaning really of like choosing to use your time in a seemingly gratuitous way.
Yeah.
Putting up shots instead of being productive. But you say that ultimately there is like real joy in that. To kind of dig into that, I spoke with Marcus Boone for the podcast as well. He's another Duke University Press author, and he has a book about his relationship with music over the years. And it's similar in the sense that he's really talking about this like war for our time that people are constantly engaged in. Is that protecting of play, of like non-productive time, a main theme in the book? And how's it connected to your relationship to these spaces of playing that you're remembering throughout the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fine line in between protecting time, that whether you want to call it meditation or some sort of, I can't stand the rhetoric of wellness. I don't want to buy into it, but you can imagine there's a slew of words, basically something that's positive and constructive, and just completely, being a drug addict and just nodding off and trying to get away from it all, and a sheer act of escapism. I mean, of course, as you pointed out, like I make the point that like AI going on about, and by the way, how fantastic is it that Allen Iverson's nickname has been suddenly shot into the stratosphere of usage in the culture with the words AI.
Yes.
I can't even figure out what the ironies of that are, but the NBA player who may be the least robotic, the least language model-y in terms of like the most unpredictable, the most untethered, the most organically in a flow state of his own game, like the least artificial intelligence style of play is named AI. Moving on. Yeah, I mean, more concisely, I don't know the answer to the question, except that it's heads or tails. Is it a beautiful refuge and a valuable act of like protection? Not totally different than, I don't know, the way some people deal with birding or whatever they do to kind of get into a positive, concentrated state, reading, writing, or is it, going to a bar to, at an unseemly hour.
Right. Yeah. And this is like obviously like a central comparison that you're making in the book. And you gesture to your relationship to alcohol over time and stuff. And it's like, it is the case that, and I think Eve Sedgwick wrote about this, that, you can kind of get addicted to anything, right? Like the pathologization of drug misuse is easy. It's like an easy scapegoat in some ways. But you can certainly get obsessed with various forms of kind of endless self-discipline, which is something you also talk about in the book. I think Kevin Garnett is sort of the figure for you of this kind of like almost pathological self-discipline, or at least you're speculating on whether it's love or that kind of obsession.
Yeah. Masochism is the word I was.
Sure.
Well, just for your listeners' sake, I'm talking about a guy who would go on to be not just a famous, wealthy professional athlete, but notoriously aggressive, in your face, psychologically dominant, one of the great aggressive trash talkers of all time. That this guy, Kevin Garnett, as a young kid, would show up at his neighborhood playground where there was an older, bigger, stronger guy who would just abuse him, beat the shit out of him. It's almost like some Freudian allegory of abuse. It all happened to Garnett, and then he learns it and turns it around, and it's seen as an incredibly positive thing. Garnett is funny. He's a great player. He's a multimillionaire. What's to complain about? He feels very himself. Like he's achieved some sort of he hasn't been stepped on in the world. But on the other side, like, what the hell is going on here? That he keeps going back to this place that he gets abused, and I was fascinated by that detail. The guy, his abuser, I mean, it's absurd to use this language, but never mind. Maybe it's not absurd. I own you. That's what this guy, his name was Bear, apparently.
Yeah.
I tried to find him. I tried to get into the South Carolina. I couldn't. Got close, but that was the line that he would say, I own you. And I'm sure there were a few expletives in there. And I just thought this was quite interesting. Do we valorize his dedication to the game and his craft? Or do we send him to a friggin' psychoanalyst? Like, come on, dude, why step away from the abuse? Like, it's a strange sort of riddle that I was interested in and related to.
For me, I appreciate the kind of not like totally neutral, but sort of non-judgmental way that you just sort of speculate on what's going on there. Because one academic position would be to say, this is like obviously kind of hyper masculinity run amok, that like fetishizing domination the way we do with our metaphors and talking about aggression and all these things. It's probably not good for society, but you sort of confess that on some level you are attached to bringing that level of intensity to like pickup games because it's just more fun.
Correct.
So it's like not denying that that exhilaration is real too, as part of the point. And so like I like that it occupies this sort of position of ambivalence to some extent. And I think about it in relationship to like somebody like Jamal Murray, right? The starting point guard for the Denver Nuggets.
Right. We come back to Canada.
Yeah, like growing up in Kitchener, Ontario, he apparently was like put through the paces by his father, made to run uphill backwards in the morning, like just the endless kind of martial self-discipline.
Push-ups in the snow is the famous image.
Right. Yeah. And somebody might look at that and say like, well, that is punitive and unnecessary, but Murray swears by that level of discipline. And obviously it paid off because he's able to shoot with enormous like control and poise, and he's now an NBA champion and all that stuff.
I have a few thoughts, but first I want to interject at this interval to say how grateful I am at how closely you seem to have read this book, and how sort of amused and intrigued I am that a serious intellectual with conversant in academic literature. I guarantee you that no other podcast I've been on for this book has mentioned like Eve Sedgwick and not even Edie Sedgwick, come to think of it. But the point is, thank you for this. It's great. And back to what you're talking about. Yeah, the toxicity of this way of being, this hyper masculinity, is totally fucked up. It's not at all clear that it's a healthy thing. It's not at all clear that playing pickup basketball is in any way good for you physically or mentally. It's a place where you can get hurt physically and mentally, and for better and for worse, that's part of it. I'm a little nervous about stepping into too grand an allegory, but that's true of public space in general. It's kind of what's fun about cities. It's kind of what's fun about being out and about. There's an element of unpredictability, and pickup basketball, and over here in one corner, high-end athletic culture, in the other corner, and then the sports writing and the rhetoric around sports, which is a bigger category. It's quite toxic. It's absurd, actually, and sometimes funny. Like, even, in fact, Allen Iverson is often quite funny.
It's true.
And he was a king of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is like a theatricality to it at that stage that you write about to some extent in terms of your work as a journalist following the NBA, your sort of proximity to basketball gods. But you mentioned public space and the kind of unpredictability of it, undecidability of it. Like this is the way the book is structured. Like you're thinking about these two axes, the world of organized basketball, the world of pickup basketball. And I like that you stress basketball is a sport that contains many games. I like that you pointed out that it can be played alone. I really relate to that. But the spaces for that kind of play, that diversity of different kinds of play, seems to be shrinking, and that's a major concern for you too. If the game has all these different forms, you kind of need those forms to have spaces where they can thrive. And so I wondered if you could kind of expand on this sense that you have that street ball in New York specifically is in decline. Like you're not sure if that's a paranoid belief or the product of nostalgia, but you seem to land on the idea that it is happening and it's the product of certain things like gentrification and so on. Could you offer some thoughts on just like the erosion of public space and where in the book you found a sense of how a collective will, a sense of community can fight to preserve those spaces?
Well, that's a huge question. This is actually the first moment that it's occurred to me why, given your other interests and your other guests, the ecological overlap here, because
Yeah, yeah.
there was a feeling of like the structure, the physical spaces, the public spaces, if you will, are pretty like built in to us. Speaking of New York, specifically New York, but a lot of these cities, New York just happens for strange reasons, having a lot to do with Robert Moses, and who in many ways, as anyone who's read The Power Broker knows, is like a total villain, but he was pretty great about parks. The fact that there
Mm-hmm.
are all these playgrounds and basketball courts right next to the highways he built is not a coincidence. I
Mm-hmm.
did as much research as I could to establish that the New York City is the highest number of public basketball courts, and that there's no other city in America that has more. I had fun thrashing away in the archives, just trying to get a handle on when was the meeting when they decided like every park will have like a sprinkler, monkey bars, a seesaw, maybe a handball court, and then over there a basketball court. And the best I could do was a meeting in the 1930s when they were discussing a variety of hobbyist amateur athletic possibilities. Among them was jacks, where like the little bouncing ball, and you
Mm-hmm.
pick up these little pieces. And I couldn't get any closer, but I just loved the thought that there was one guy in a meeting going, "Every playground needs a jacks court."
Yeah, kids love jacks.
And like hopscotch, it's like, well, what are we going to do? And the basketball prevailed, and everyone got a basketball hoop. But um, zooming all the way back to what you're saying, I don't know for sure what's going on.
Mm.
Gentrification is definitely part of it, but another thing that I talk about is professionalization of childhood. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know, playgrounds used to have this sort of tiered world of like the little kids, the young kids, the not so young kids, the high school kids, the older kids, the guys with the older kids, the A court, the B court sort of thing. And there's now a lot of talent that doesn't just go out and play in this unstructured way, that they are involved in structured athletics, AAU, or they have a private coach, or they go to a day camp. And there's nothing wrong with this per se, but it does shrink the pool of people who just come out to play. And for a while, I think that was one of the other things, along with gentrification, along with video games, and the online life.
Mm-hmm.
But I wrote an addendum in the book. The piece alludes to a visit to the court in Harlem where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had lived near and played when he was a kid. And I go up there and play some pretty good half court pickup ball, but it's kind of thin on the ground. And I leave, and I am sort of dismissive of this gaggle of very young kids. They were just running up and down. It barely qualified as basketball. And that was like 2015. And then like 7 years later, I'm driving down somewhere with the windows down, and suddenly I'm convinced that I'm listening to Giannis Antetokounmpo talking, like
Oh
in the
yeah.
next car. And I
Right.
look over, like, wow, is that Giannis? And in that moment, I realized, like, hey, I was too quick to be like, yeah, there are kids on the playground, but that's not basketball. It's like, who the hell knows? They were all 12. And
Mm-hmm.
7 years later, one of them, just Pascal Siakam. I mean, Joel Embiid. I mean, it's one of the weird
Mm-hmm.
features of our basketball landscape is how the idea was that the game would be global and it would be great, and all the owners and the NBA would make lots of money because this new market would open up. I don't think it was anticipated that the new markets would then feed superstars back into the league.
Mm. Yeah, there's like a expanding number of examples. I mean,
Yeah.
Jokic was recruited and drafted in the second round in large part because of this kind of expanding of global recruitment. So there's been this kind of like border crossing that has happened, and in some ways, that Adam Sandler film Hustle is like about that, right?
Yeah.
That the discovery of a player that then you develop, but we're imagining these players primarily as commodities, I think.
Hmm.
And that to me is like the concerning thing. And to kind of stay on that idea of the kind of, in a way, the unique temporality of playground basketball, and just like making room for play. The book does talk about sort of leaving room for improvisation in basketball, and kind of gestures at certain moments to like the ways that analytics have made the professional game really regimented and rigid. Do you think that like analytics specifically, like looking at a player who might be unorthodox, like Jokic, and think like,
Hmm.
how do I squeeze every bit of potential out of this player and fit him into the NBA game? Do you think that like mechanizes athletic performance? And do you think those techniques of kind of like optimization can ever fully automate athletic performance, or is there something that always escapes?
Well, to answer your last question first, no. I think
Mm,
there's always going to be something anarchic and random and bizarre because
right.
that's what human beings are. And sometimes this bizarre anarchy is manifested physically. Like, for example, you get Anthony Davis at 6'1" as a junior that no one cares about. And by the
Mm,
beginning of his senior year, he's 6'10" and people are freaking out. It's quite unusual to have like a number one draft, whatever, someone so sought after have been anonymous so recently. It's because he just grew. And there's
yeah.
lots of examples like that. Um, the analytics, I'm not concerned about players being mechanized, but and in some ways I think they're actually fun and interesting because you look at Jokic and you go, wow, he's doing beautiful, bizarre things. It's hard to fully understand what he's doing until you're presented with these detailed analytics that explain to you that he's making such a high percentage of his shots. So that makes it each time he touches the ball so valuable. But they also explain to you, unlike all the other big superstars, that when he gets the ball, say his countrymen more or less approximately Luka Doncic. Doncic gets the ball. He keeps the ball. The ball is in Luka's hand for a long time.
Hmm.
Jokic is like, get this out. He just wants to give it away as fast as he can.
Yeah, he's dominant, but he's not ball dominant. Yeah.
Yes, it's all. So I don't begrudge analytics as a way of appreciating the game. Um, but I just for the record, I think you're raising toxic masculinity in sports and basketball and playground basketball is very interesting.
Hmm.
And I'm usually quite averse to the phrase and the topic, which I feel is too simplistic. But in this case, it's interesting because I can hear in your voice that you're valorizing and valuing public space and the sort of
Hmm.
demos of a public place where people have to come and sort things out among themselves. So, yay, great. But that's also a place where there's all kinds of batshit behavior, like the Kevin Garnett discussion we had. I own you. You have to deal with that.
Yeah, no. And I've experienced that myself. Like these random conflicts with sort of alpha males don't just take place at the highest levels of the sport. They can certainly take place, as it were, at the grassroots. So valorizing it it can be simplistic too. Um, but I just sort of
But wait, I need to interject. Are you a basketball player?
yeah, to some extent, but not to the point. Like, I think because of these experiences where I've been embarrassed by more dominant players, I don't look for competitive play at all. Like, I just shoot on my own. I shoot around with other people. I play with
So, but that's
kids.
a
That
yes in
kind of.
that case.
That's a
I
yes.
mean
Yeah,
that
that'd be a
if
yes.
you're if you find pleasure in like shooting a basketball by yourself, then yes, you play basketball.
I
Got it.
certainly do. Yeah.
Because I was fascinated when I looked at all your other guests and I went, wow, my book does not immediately, make sense in the context of your other
Mm.
guests on this podcast. Thrilled to be here, but thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a fascination of mine. Like, there's this fun moment in your book where you talk about this kind of dad mode coming over you of just needing to disconnect by watching a game. I sort of have that too. That basketball is a way, if I'm watching it as a spectator sport, to kind of just, in a sense, turn my brain off, or at least experience something that doesn't require that level of like conscious focus. And I do just appreciate it. I mean, like, the fact of the matter is, there is like ultimately real beauty in just like jump shooting. I mean, I really liked how you detailed the mechanics of different shooters' jump shots and movements. I honestly kind of wanted to unpack that too. Like, your description of Damian Lillard's half court series ending bomb of a three pointer
Hmm.
against
Hmm.
the Thunder in 2019 is just perfect. So, like, first of all, what are your kind of favorite shooters to watch? Do you prefer kind of fluid textbook shooters, or kind of more funky, unorthodox shooters?
To answer that question directly, I think I gravitate a bit towards weird, unorthodox players like Jokic or James Harden. To take
Mm-hmm.
a step further back from that, I was just in a kind of book club environment around the book with one of the people there was a former dance critic for the New Yorker named Mindy Aloff, who's just published a book called Why Dance Matters. And she asked me somewhat similar questions, to which my response was that I certainly don't write about basketball like a dance critic, but I do feel like I want to attend to something that is otherwise suppressed as being too weird in most writing about sports. When you're just, these are bodies, these are physical beings and their movements and their habits and their needs physically. And, I recall and repeat a couple of times this tossed out remark that a marginal NBA player by the name of Al Farouk Aminu made to me when he was quite young when he said it. He's like, your body is your business. And I was like, wow,
Mm-hmm.
that's intense. And this is a guy who is not a super duper star. I've been around the other extreme of this is Zion Williamson, who's such a superstar, who's been an international celebrity since he hit puberty and has been like an Instagram media sensation since he was 15 years old, who's now made so much money already that he's having I shouldn't say a hard time is treating his body like a business. He seems to be trying to take care of his body better, but he's had a very hard time staying on the court. There's been issues about his professionalism. Um, and I've tried to write about this. The Zion story is so weird and it's been hard to put that into words, but I do try to just account to the physical realities of bodies in these discussions, including the fact that these are players who are much more physically exposed than any other professional athlete.
I like that you point out that kind of baseline fact about, no pun intended, baseline fact about
Yeah, yeah.
basketball, that
It's a
there
sideline
there
fact.
is
Yeah,
there is more body exposure. You talk a bit about like the introduction of these sleeved
yeah,
jerseys
yeah,
as kind of a marketing thing. And I know LeBron like hated them. He said like it
yeah,
affected. There's no margin for error with his jump shot, and it
yeah,
threw everything off.
yeah.
So it is a very embodied like thing. And I think one direction I wanted to take that in is to talk about defense. Like, at one point in the Latrell Sprewell piece, you talk about like that player's really strong defensive abilities and link it
Yeah,
to this like will to power.
yeah,
And Draymond Green has talked quite a bit this past season, about how defense is a matter of will.
yeah,
And I think like people don't talk enough about the greatest defenders. I don't think, like, the players who win Defensive Player of the Year in the NBA are certainly celebrated, but not in the same way. Like, they do the
right.
dirty work. They are movable walls that protect the paint. That's what they do. And so, but I wonder, like, if basketball is jazz, as David Thorpe says, what quality does defense have? In that kind of point counterpoint production of a melody. Like, when somebody like James Harden crosses up a defender, sits him down, it does
Yeah.
feel musical. And so, yeah, I mean, how do you think about the role of defense generally?
No, it's just do I want to dwell for a moment on this intriguing notion that you can correlate flourishes offensively to musical flourishes, but what about defensively? Like, what's that? Like John Bonham's right foot? Like, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I mean, what I can bring to this discussion is that the professional level, defense is the obsession of people who want to win games and win series and then playoffs and on and on. At the more personal amateur level that I'm at, it's part of this thing that you mentioned earlier where I'm trying to ratchet up the intensity because it's more fun. So I play defense. I kind of want my teammates to play defense. I talk on defense. Jokic has been very helpful for understanding certain possibilities in the pick and roll and the half court. Jamal Murray and Jokic being this amazing two-man game where one can set a screen for the other. They're almost interchangeable, even though they're such different sizes. And then you have to defend that, and the way you defend that is you talk. So, I mean, I'm more invested in defense in the same way. I mean, frankly, more invested in the whole thing now than I was when I had a coach, in high school and college yelling at me.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think like the whole thing is there's like just generally glory in getting to experience the many ways that you can like get the ball to go through the hoop, but it's obviously defense that wins games. Yeah, I mean, we've kind of circled around it, but the Denver Nuggets are NBA champions. It's the thing that just happened, right? And the main reason for the ascent of that team is certainly Nikola Jokic. The essay in the book called The Jokic Files, like it seemed to be the longest piece in the whole book. So I wanted you to kind of, unpack this player a little bit. Like Jamal Murray, I love Jamal Murray. He's a good example of, as I say, that maniacal self-discipline, but Jokic is the one. Like you point out that when he won the MVP award in 2022, his player efficiency rating was 32.85, the highest in the history of the NBA. And you give a brilliant breakdown of why that was the case. He's unstoppable in the paint. He's dangerous from three. You got to guard him one-on-one. Hard to double team because, most importantly, his passing disorients defenses. So would you say Jokic is like maybe the best player in the NBA and thus the world at this point?
Oh, there's no question he's the best player in the whole world.
And it's partly because of how unique his game is, right? Like there are really no weaknesses in it per se.
I'm remembering this riff that I eventually cut because it was too bizarre. But when this Italian absurdist playwright Pirandello, he won the Nobel Prize, and Tony Kushner, the playwright, wrote something like, "Oh my God, he won the Nobel Prize." It was so absurd. He was laughing. This is a guy whose métier was absurdism, and him being recognized was absurd. And I feel that way about Jokic. It's absurd. It's absurd to say Nikola Jokic is the best player in the world. He can't jump off the ground. He doesn't look very athletic. Everything he does that's amazing it's almost a visual disconnect. The ball just went in, that, so that's good. But it looked so ungainly or counterintuitive or ungraceful. What happened with me was he made a pass at the end of a game, and I think 2018. I saw it and I thought, that's interesting. What's up with that dude? And started to pay attention, and very quickly was really rewarded with that. Just he was interesting to think about and look at. And then as I got closer to finishing the book, I was going to write something about him. I was writing something about him. Now the book is finished. There's a piece in the book about Jokic, but I don't feel particularly satisfied with the piece. The whole production of the book was held up for quite a long time, like almost a year, while I flailed around and tried to do more reporting or just sort of hyperventilated about Nikola Jokic. All the while, my energy seemed to be legitimized by the fact that he kept doing more and more amazing things. I started writing the piece when he was this obscure guy, and I'm pretty candid about the fact that he looked like a fat kid who'd been picked on in the playground, and I was a fat kid who got picked on in the playground. I'm projecting that he looks like his feelings have been hurt. It's like nonsense. I don't think his feelings were hurt, or if they were, who knows? I have no way of knowing that. I'm just projecting. But from that identification, grew this interest, and then the interest was rewarded by this bizarre player who was actually quite good, and then he kept getting better, the accomplishments got better, my sense of dissatisfaction with the piece
Mm-hmm.
continued, and it just sort of grew until I just put a cap on it. I'm very proud of the piece. I will say that I think it's a piece about a guy who existed from like 2014 to about 2020, 21, like Jokic 1.0, and I think he's in a different place physically now.
Mm.
So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And there's a few things I want to kind of pick up on there. The first one, I guess, because it's like it's topical, is that in terms of this finals run, like this Nuggets championship, there's a moment in the book where you talk about how, quote, every finals series feels as though profound statements are being made about fate, practice, preparation, self-restraint, self-sacrifice, and team culture. Um, do you think that the narrative that you're starting to see in certain places, that the Nuggets had a relatively easy path to the championship, is fair? Or is it a kind of continuation of that weird narrative around Jokic as an unorthodox player, as an underdog?
the latter.
Yeah, interesting. Because like that is obviously like an important theme in terms of like the Jokic piece that people don't see his game for what it is, or don't value the things that are unorthodox about it. And there's this way in which the championship is supposed to reinforce all of these things, or like validate them, and yet even for people that have seen the effects, it's like it's not enough because he doesn't fit the kind of prototype.
Let's go back to the aesthetics and dance and that whole notion of the body.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Jokic is not aesthetically beautiful. If you look at like Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan, they're dancers, they're gorgeous, and Jokic is not gorgeous. He's not even particularly cute. He looks like Stan Laurel. I think this produces some awkward feelings among sports fans who are these days all sort of amateur sports marketers, backseat general managers. It's just,
It's true.
I attribute a lot of it to that. I mean, if Luka Doncic achieves his potential and he wins a championship, I think people will be much happier to jump on that bandwagon. Luka's pretty cute. He's funny. Well, Jokic is hilarious, but
He's ungainly, as you say. His gait. You describe his gait, which is
oh my God.
so on the money, right? The way he walks
J-
back to the bench.
by
Yeah.
far, if you were going to give $1 million, you would give a prize to the not just NBA player, professional athlete who most embodies the movements of Charlie Chaplin's The Tramp. Tell me there's another
Yeah.
player who could even come within a million miles.
That's really interesting to me too. Just again, thinking about this as an embodied thing rather than these people as gods, as it were, like people who are somehow almost immaterial and sublime. But you've just to a couple times this question of race, right? So you talk about entering into the territory of others on the playground, and like clarify that this is really about entering a quote largely black environment in which a white, weak, soft, very tall kid appeared. Um, like the links between basketball and racial politics is sort of an undercurrent in the book, but it's not like a thing you engage directly. But it does have like this long, complex history. So I wondered if you like why you kind of shied away from that. Is it because you feel like other stuff has been written that focuses on that, and why you didn't necessarily want to open up a discussion about like the connections between racial politics and basketball?
I feel like to answer you directly, that playing pickup basketball on playgrounds anywhere and everywhere is both simultaneously like becoming immersed in the issues of that nature, but at the same time, it's inures you to it. It's like
Mm.
fish water. You don't have to define it. You're just in it. It's in a weird way a refuge almost from the discussion. Some white guys, definitely myself included, feel vaguely proud of themselves that like, hey, I don't give a shit. I'll go anywhere. I'll play with anybody. And they're suspicious of other white guys because the real physical violence I've been subject to on pickup basketball courts is from other white guys. This just happened a few days ago at Brooklyn Bridge Park.
Really?
I had this epic stretch of playing just recently where I was reminded that like my idea of paradise is like playing pickup basketball till you think you're going to die.
Right.
At some point it rained. We moved under the shed part, the roofed part in that particular playground. It was very noisy. It was just a lot of craziness. And I happened to be on a team with this outrageously like Kobe meets Pascal Siakam sort of kid. And you just can't believe how much one kid can affect winning, especially this was 4-on-4 half court. And we just kept winning and it went on. And I was just like, all right, I'll just do this until I literally expire. But there was this problem at one point, and it was like we had to raise our voices.
Wow. No, yeah. And yeah, I mean, the people, it's interesting, like the way you talked about it, the people that you play with on public courts are often anonymous to you.
Often. I mean,
yeah,
I had this horrifying thing where, so I become friendly with the Vassar basketball coach. That's where I went to school, like the antithesis of a basketball powerhouse. And he gave me a shirt because now every single school, no matter how artsy, has like some slightly jazzed up athletic program. It says Vassar basketball. And this happened over a year ago. There was some situation that I was antagonized by, and there was some raised voices. And then it was over. And then this kid comes up to me and goes, wow, are you connected to Vassar? Because I'm going there next year. And I just thought to myself, oh, Lord, and I corresponded with the coach, and sure enough, he told me all about the kid and on and on. But, I cherish the anonymity, and I thought to myself, like, don't wear that goddamn shirt anymore. I don't want to, I used to play at the Tulane University gym, and I still do sometimes, but it's a little tricky because I don't really want to be there as a professor. I don't want to be in that role. I just want to be a player and free to do whatever.
For sure. There's just a level of security in the anonymity and in the spontaneous community that, pickup basketball produces. There's actually like a really hilarious stand-up comedian named Shang Wang who jokes in his Netflix special, Sweet and Juicy is the title of it, that his pickup basketball team is like kind of like the team he would do a heist with. Like you don't know each other that well, but you sort of have to trust each other to get the job done. And ultimately what you're trying to do is not die. Like you are pushing yourself to presumably improve your health, I guess. But he's also, I think, talking about being competitive without being too competitive. Like when the guys show up that are fit, he's like, well, you don't belong here. Right. And so there's an interesting balance there where you're committed to the game, but you're not committed necessarily to a certain notion of like superiority or like, I don't know, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but how do you find that balance, I guess? And why do you like the community that pickup basketball provides?
I want to object to the words balance and community. I will say that I found myself playing this sort of oppositional role here because there's beautiful and empowering and positive things about playground basketball, pickup basketball that are articulated and celebrated in a number of venues and books and podcasts. And I am the guy who wants to stand up for all the negativity, hostility, problems. It's not, it's when you say balance, I think to myself, no, I'm either ecstatic to be playing well or I'm in a state of total despair, miserable. The opening of the book is like I get essentially bullied by this giant dude. My little 9-year-old is around to see it.
That's true.
I think everything's okay. And I'm chatting with him like, yeah, well, you just play hard and do your best. And my 9-year-old or 10-year-old, maybe he was at the time, he's like, I think he's all cool. Everything's good. And he just goes, we should find that guy and murder him. And I'm like, oh no. Oh crap.
And actually murder him. Yeah.
I'm like, oh my God, what am I exposing the kid to? And
right.
And
you're trying to be honest about those things. Yeah. I get it.
I just feel like I'm either all in and it's absurd. And then I have this moment of clarity, like, what are you doing? You're a grown man. This is a playground. Get outside of this stupid little recreational space and take care of your body, take care of your family, do your work. It's absurd. So, but there's a lot of voices speaking not incorrectly about these wonderful qualities. And I'm here to talk about what an insane self-destructive activity it is.
Right. But it's funny, like it's insane, it's self-destructive, it's agonistic, and antagonistic,
Mhm.
but there's also, you say, like a mystical, spiritual allure that isn't necessarily, opposed to those things. Like that those two things are actually not mutually exclusive.
Absolutely.
There can be something transformative about like competition in a sense, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess like maybe one way to think about that would be to ask about being like angry basically about being relegated to the post.
Oh my God.
You talk about the post as a prison, right?
Mhm.
And like somebody like Jokic is obviously like more than a post player, and in some ways a symbol of how that traditional center role is a thing of the past. Um, but you talk about how like you were pigeonholed as a taller person as basically, a player that should go down low.
Yeah.
And it was really only by dedicating yourself to like improving your 3-point shot that you were able to break out of that. Have you thought any more about like this idea that big guys need to learn how to shoot? Is there any nostalgia for players that are just about like back to the basket brutality, room for hardworking centers like Steven Adams, for example? Or are those players like gone for good?
Well, I love Steven Adams,
He's great.
the
Yeah.
drollest man in the NBA.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, Adams is amazing. He's definitely a role for him. That takes us perilously close to talking about John Morant, which is pretty interesting
Yeah.
culturally. And here's my 2 cents. I mean, I'm so amused to hear your level of engagement with basketball, knowing the nature of your other interests and the nature of your other guests, but I'm just going to go with it. I thank you for your close read. Um, it's not just that, Tom got better at shooting threes. It's also just the culture of basketball became more acclimated to the notion of like Brooke Lopez, shooting threes, and
Mm-hmm.
basically every big guy.
Splash Mountain.
Right. Well, there are some exceptions. Steven Adams is actually one of them, but largely now it's understood that those Adams can't shoot threes, but he can defend on the perimeter. He can switch off of picks.
He can, yeah.
But the other side of the Jokic story, since we're here, I feel almost a little abashed to go here, but you brought us here, I'll do it. The other side of the Jokic story is he's re-glamorized the post in ways I never could have anticipated. And he does it because, when you get the ball in the post, your back is to the place you're going to shoot at. So there's this weird, like, operating in the dark moment. This brings us all the way back to shooting in the dark. You need to turn and shoot. Or in the case of Kareem, he sort of turns and shoots at the same time. Like, that's what the skyhook was. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of revealed to you, like, where you're going at the exact moment you're letting go of the ball. And it's fraught, and it's kind of stressful. And the big mistake is to rush. And I feel like Jokic's incredible contribution, both as a post player and more generally, is just he doesn't rush. He's the most unhurried guy. He's going to take his time. He's like Ferdinand the Bull or something, just going to sniff the flowers. I've got the ball. I'll pivot this way, maybe that way. How about I come back here? He's on Jokic time, and I think that's awesome. So I'm so pleased that I can leave the post. I'm warmer. I feel more warmly towards it than I have in quite a long time.
Obviously, like one of the big ideas in the book is this notion of your game being a process, you being a project, and you say you used to hate that, but now you kind of like it.
Love it.
The players that I like watching, that's what makes them interesting, is year after year, like seeing what they add to their game.
Who?
Well, like somebody like Harden, right? Like you talk about the increasing number of step backs that he took, and whether it was a travel. He talked about like in the off season one year, adding like a side step to that step back, which I don't think he ever really integrated.
Right.
So those are the kinds of things, and just like hearing players like Giannis talk about like trying to make their game more boring in a sense at one point, right? Like,
yes.
I think that's interesting. And also almost equally interesting is thinking about players who can't really evolve their game, like Westbrook, like.
Here's my 2 cents. I mean, I'm so amused to hear your level of engagement with basketball, knowing the nature of your other interests and the nature of your other guests. I thank you for your close read.